Lakota chief sat alone in the ash of his burnt lodge. A widow knelt and helped him rebuild it. The ash was still warm under my hands. I know that because I pressed both palms flat against it, not to feel for heat, not for any reason a man could explain standing up straight in the daylight. I just put my hands down and held them there, and the warmth came up through my skin like something trying to tell me it wasn't finished yet. Or maybe I was trying to tell myself. The lodge had been mine for 22 years. My father's before that, though he called the place by a different name, a name I won't say here, because names belong to the people who earned them, and I was not certain I had earned mine anymore. The posts were still standing. 5 of them, black and stripped and listing slightly east the way a tired man leans into wind. The hides were gone. Everything stretched over those poles, everything my wife's hands had touched, everything my daughters had slept beneath, gone in the space of a night I wasn't there to stop. I had been 3 days' ride north when the fire came. When I got back, the village was already rebuilding itself the way villages do, slowly, without asking permission from grief. Children moved around me with the careful wide arc children use when they don't understand why an adult is sitting on the ground. My second in command, a man called Crow, looks back, stood at a respectful distance for 2 days. He brought me water. He brought me dried meat wrapped in a piece of cloth I didn't recognize. He didn't speak, which was how I knew he understood what had happened to me, not the fire, but the thing underneath the fire. My wife had died the previous winter. My daughters were grown and gone to their own lodges, their own husbands, their own fires. The lodge I had lost was the last place on the ground that still held the shape of who I used to be. A husband. A man someone came home to. When Crow looks back finally did speak, on the 3rd morning he said, "There is a woman asking to see you." I told him to send her away. He said she wouldn't go. I looked up at him. He had a careful face. Crow looks back. Hard to read, and he'd spent 50 years making it that way. But there was something in it right then, not amusement, not quite. Something more like a man who has watched the world long enough to know that certain things are going to happen whether you cooperate or not, and he was simply waiting to see which way I'd choose to be about it. I said, "What kind of woman doesn't go when a man tells her to go?" He said, "The kind that walks 4 miles carrying lumber on a travois." Her name was Margaret Aldous, and she was white, which is the first thing I should say because it is the thing most people would say first, and I am trying to tell this the way it happened rather than the way it sounds. She was a widow. Her husband had ranched the valley below the ridge for 11 years before a horse fell on him during a spring roundup and broke him in a way he didn't come back from. She had kept the ranch herself for 2 years after that. I knew of her the way you know of certain people in a territory, by reputation before you know the face. The Aldous woman who didn't sell. The woman who paid fair wages and ran a clean operation and once turned away a cattle buyer from Wichita because he tried to short her on the weight and she'd caught it. People told that story with a specific kind of respect that has nothing to do with being kind and everything to do with not being fooled. She came into the ash circle with the travois behind her and her boots leaving clear prints in the gray dust, and she stopped 6 feet from me and looked at the standing poles, and then she looked at me. She had brown hair going to gray at the temples and a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and eyes the color of Winter Creek water. Not blue exactly, not gray exactly, some color that only exists in moving things. She said, "I'm sorry about your lodge." I said, "You should go, Mrs. Aldous." She said she'd heard that already. I said, "I mean it." She said, "I know you do, but I've got 400 board feet of pine on that travois, and I didn't haul it up here to haul it back down." I looked at her for a long time. She looked back without any apology in it. Not defiant, either, that's what I want to be clear about. There was nothing in her face that was trying to win something. She just looked at me the way a person looks at a thing they've already decided about. I said, "I don't want your pine." She said, "That may be, but your people can use it while you're deciding." And that was the thing I couldn't argue past, because she was right. Pine doesn't wait for a man to sort out his grief. My people needed what she'd brought, and she knew it, and she had brought it anyway without asking whether she was welcome. That kind of practical decency is hard to be angry at. I'd spent 3 days getting good and angry at a lot of things, and she just walked right around the outside of all of it with 400 board feet and didn't even seem to notice she'd done it. I got up. My knees were stiff. 3 days of sitting in ash will do that to a man of 61. I stood up and she watched me get all the way upright without offering a hand, which I was grateful for, because I didn't need a hand and I would have refused it, and that would have started us wrong. I said, "Where do you want it?" She said, "Wherever you tell me." We worked through the rest of that day. The village worked with us. Crow looks back organized the young men with the kind of quiet efficiency he'd spent a lifetime building, and the women brought food around mid-afternoon, and Margaret Aldous worked in the middle of it all without making anything of herself. That was what I kept noticing. She didn't set herself apart and she didn't try to fold herself in either. She was just there, doing the next thing that needed doing. When a post needed another set of hands, she put her hands on it. When a boy of about 14 got his fingers caught in a rope, she talked him through getting loose with such steadiness that he wasn't even embarrassed, just freed. I watched her the way you watch something that doesn't quite make sense yet. Not because she was a white woman working in a Lakota camp. I had known enough of the world to know that people are complicated on the inside regardless of what they look like on the outside. It was something else. She moved like a person who had already worked out where she stood in relation to grief, and had found a way to be functional inside it without having to pretend it wasn't there. There's a kind of people who, when they've lost something big, they build walls against the loss. And there's another kind who just keep working in the middle of it, and the working is how they hold themselves together, and maybe they hold other people together too without meaning to. My wife had been that second kind. I had been the first. By late afternoon we had 2 new support structures up and Crow looks back had found additional hides from storage, and things were beginning to take a shape I could look at. Not my lodge yet, not what it had been, but the beginning of a lodge. The skeleton of one, which is something. A skeleton is not nothing. Margaret Aldous sat on a log at the edge of the camp and drank water from a skin one of the women had given her, and I walked over and sat down at the other end of the log. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "I lost my house once. Not to fire. Flood 3 years after we came here. It took everything in it. I remember sitting outside where the walls used to be and thinking, I don't know how to be me without this place." I said, "Did it come back?" She said, "The house came back. I'm not sure about the me." I looked at her. She was looking out at the valley below, where the light was going long and gold across the grass. She wasn't saying it to be sad about it. She wasn't performing anything. She was just saying the true thing the way you say it when you've had enough time with it that it doesn't cut the same way anymore. I said, "My wife died in the winter." She said, "I know, I'm sorry." I said, "The lodge was the last place I could still feel her." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's not in the lodge." I looked at her again. She said, "I don't mean that to be hard. I just mean, I've spent 2 years trying to find my husband in specific objects in specific places, and he's not in any of them. He's in how I run the ranch. He's in a couple of things I learned from him. He's in the way I argue with cattle buyers." She paused. "He's not where I thought he was." I didn't say anything to that, but I sat there for a while longer before I got up. She came back the next day. Not with lumber this time. She'd left the travois behind. She came up the ridge in the early morning with a cloth bag over one shoulder and a look on her face that said she had thought about whether to come and had decided yes, and was not going to explain the decision. I was already up. I had slept inside the partial lodge, which was strange, the open spaces where the walls weren't finished, yet let in the night air and the sound of the plains, and I had lain awake for a while listening to the wind come through the gaps. not in a sad way, or not only in a sad way, in the way you listen to things when you're starting to come back to yourself. She sat down near where the fire had been, a small fire, just enough to boil water, and she opened the cloth bag and took out a collection of things I didn't expect. A jar of something, dried herbs bundled with cord, a small steel tool I couldn't identify. She said, "My husband had a bad winter about 8 years in. Not sickness, he was never sick. A kind of winter of the mind. He said everything felt like it was behind glass. He could see his life, but he couldn't touch it." I said, "I know that feeling." She said, "What brought him back was work. Not big work, small work, making things with his hands, something that required just enough attention that the glass wasn't there for a few minutes, and then gradually a few hours, and eventually it was just gone." She looked at the cloth bag. "I brought you something to do." I looked into the bag. Rope, needles, some kind of treated leather cut into strips, tools for repair work. She said, "I have a saddle that needs relacing. I have no one to do it right now. I'll pay you in store credit, or not if you don't want it that way." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back with that same Creekwater steadiness, not asking me to be anything, just offering the thing and letting me decide. I said, "Bring the saddle." She did. I am going to tell the next part as honestly as I can, which means I am going to tell it out of order because that is how I lived it. There was a week of mornings where she came up the ridge and there was work to do, and we did it. There was an afternoon where I told her about my wife, not the dying, but the living, which is the part people never ask about because they think grief is only about the end, and she listened the way good listeners listen, which is mostly by not saying anything, just being there and letting the words have room. There was a morning where she didn't come, and I noticed the noticing, which told me something I wasn't ready to look at directly. There was an evening where I rode down to the valley and helped her fix a fence that had come down in a storm, and 2 of her ranch hands were there, and they looked at me the way some men look, measuring, suspicious. And she looked at them with an expression so flat and clear that they went back to work without another word. And I thought, there is a woman who does not waste herself on other people's opinions. There was the night the lodge was finished. It was not the same lodge, it couldn't be. But it was a lodge, and it was mine, and Crow looks back had hung something above the door, a piece of his own medicine bundle, a very old bird bone wrapped in red cloth, and when I asked him why, he said, "Because you are still here, which is not nothing." Margaret Aldous was there that night. She had come up to see it finished. The village had a small gathering, nothing elaborate, just fires and food and people being near each other, which is how people mark things in a place where ceremony is something you earn rather than something you perform. She stood at the edge of the gathering, and I walked to her, and we stood together looking at the new lodge, and she said, "It's good." I said, "It isn't what it was." She said, "No, it's what it is." I thought about that. The fire behind us, the lodge in front, the plains below going dark under a sky that had gone the color of iron and rose. It's what it is. Not consolation, not an instruction to feel better, just the true thing. The lodge existed. I existed. What it was no longer was not the only fact. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You're the one who did the work." I said, "You brought the lumber." She said, "You got up." I'm going to tell you something now that I told Crow looks back once, late at night, and he thought about it for a while and then said it sounded right to him, for whatever that's worth. A man who has lost the thing that defined him, the title, the lodge, the wife, the particular weight of being the person everyone else looked to. A man in that position is in danger. Not from outside, from the inside. From the voice that gets very quiet and says, "What's left to do?" The voice doesn't usually say it cruel, it says it almost gentle, like it's just asking a question. What's left? What I learned, or maybe remembered, because I think I used to know it and grief took it from me, is that the answer to that question isn't a reason. It's not a purpose or a mission or a meaning. The answer is a next thing. A saddle that needs relacing. A post that needs setting. A woman walking up a ridge with 400 board feet because she's decided to, and waiting at the top for you to get up off the ash. That's the answer. Not because it resolves anything, because it moves. There is more to tell, and I will tell it. The following spring she had trouble at the ranch. Not the kind of trouble a woman expects, not financial, not weather. A man came from the east with a deed he claimed superseded hers, and 2 other men with him who were the kind of men you hire when you want something done that you're not willing to do yourself. I heard about it on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, I rode down the ridge with Crow Looks Back and 4 young men from the village, and we arrived at the ranch yard just as the man from the east was explaining to Margaret Aldous that she had until the end of the week to vacate. She was standing in the doorway of her house with her arms crossed and a look on her face I had come to know, the flat, clear look that meant she was not going to move, but she was choosing not to raise her voice because she didn't need to. I rode into the yard and stopped. The man from the east looked at me and at the 5 men behind me and made a calculation. I could see him making it. He was the kind of man who only understood one kind of conversation, and we were speaking it clearly. I said, "This is Mrs. Aldous's land." He said, "I have a deed." I said, "I know what you have." I said, "This is Mrs. Aldous's land." He looked at the men behind me again. He looked at me. He was trying to find something in my face he could work with, anger, maybe, or uncertainty, and he wasn't finding it, because I wasn't angry and I wasn't uncertain. I was just there. I had been many things in my life and I had lost many of them, but I had not lost the capacity to stand in front of something and make it clear I was not moving. He left. He took his deed and his hired men and he left. Whether he came back another time with a larger force or a better lawyer, I don't know. What I know is he left that day, and the valley watched him go, and the valley remembered. I learned later that people talked about it for some time after, not because it was a remarkable thing, a man coming down from the ridge to stand in a yard. Men do that. It's not remarkable on its face. What they talked about, I think, was the specifics of it. Who came for who? That the chief came down for the widow. That she had walked up with her lumber and he had come down with his men. That they had, in some way the territory understood even if it didn't have words for it, chosen each other. That evening Margaret Aldous sat on her porch and I sat in the yard, and we ate the meal her ranch hand's wife had made. And the light came off the ridge the way it does in late spring, long and warm and patient, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I wanted to. She looked at me then. Not the Creekwater look. This was something different. This was the look a person gives you when they are deciding how far to trust what they feel, and they've just decided to trust it. It's a very particular look. You don't forget it once you've seen it directed at you. She said, "I think you're going to be all right, you know." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't mean eventually. I mean you already are." I want to say something about what it is to be a man who was defined for most of his life by what he carried. Not the weight of things, I mean the weight of expectation, of his people looking to him, of being the answer before the question was asked. You live inside that long enough, it becomes the air you breathe. And when it's gone, when the thing that needed you most doesn't need you the same way anymore, when the lodge burns, when the wife goes, there is a particular silence. I don't know if other men know it. I think they do. I think many men of my age know that silence very well and don't say so. What I want to say is this: the silence is not the end. I thought it was. I sat in the ash for 3 days certain that the silence was the last thing. A woman walked up a ridge with lumber on a travois, and she didn't say the silence was wrong. She didn't tell me to come out of it. She just set the lumber down and started working and waited for me to get up. And when I got up, she let me lead, because that was what I needed, not to be rescued in the way that takes something from you, but in the way that gives you back the use of your own hands. That is a specific kind of love, and it is rarer than people know. We were married in the fall, which surprised some people and surprised neither of us. Crow looks back stood with me, and her neighbor Ruth Harkins stood with her, and the ceremony was done in two traditions, because we were from two traditions, and we were not going to pretend otherwise. The valley came to the gathering afterward, or enough of it did to fill the yard and spill out into the grass, and there was food and there was music, and at one point in the evening she stood next to me with her shoulder against my arm, and I felt the weight of her there, that specific particular weight, and I thought, this is what's left. Not everything that was not my wife, not the old lodge, not the man I used to be in the world, but this particular weight in this particular moment. It's enough. I will tell you, it is more than enough. I was the chief who sat in the ash. I was the man who put his hands in the warm gray dust and couldn't explain why. I was the man who told her to go and she wouldn't go. I was the man who got up. That last one is the one that matters. The lodge stands now, different from the one before, bigger in some ways, smaller in others, full of a new silence that is not empty but only quiet. Her things are in it. Her way of organizing things, which is not my way, but I've got used to it. In the morning she gets up before I do and makes the fire, and I lie there and listen to her moving, the small sounds of it, the scrape of the flint, the breath of the flame catching, and there is not a single morning I do not feel it. The plain good luck of still being here to hear it. A man who sat in the ash. A woman who wouldn't go away. What was left turned out to be enough to build on. That is the whole of it.